It's a grey morning in Edinburgh, the kind of morning this city was built for, mist sitting low over the rooftops, the smell of rain on old stone. Above it all, on its volcanic rock, the castle. Dark, immovable, watching everything the way it has watched everything for 1,000 years. This is Edinburgh today, a city of 500,000 people, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of the most visited cities in Europe. Every August it fills with 1 million tourists for the festival. Every New Year it throws the largest street party on the planet. But beneath the tourism and the whiskey and the tartan, beneath all of it, there is a city with a story more strange and more contradictory than almost anywhere in the world. A city that produced the ideas that built the modern world, and then watched its own people get destroyed by the forces those ideas unleashed. A city divided, literally, physically divided, between a medieval world of darkness and disease and a rational, planned world of light and geometry. Two cities sharing one ridge of volcanic rock, speaking the same language, barely recognizing each other. Using AI to reconstruct historical images and engravings, we are going to walk through Edinburgh from its earliest beginnings to the city it is today. We will climb the castle. We will walk the closes of the old town. We will cross the bridge into the new town and understand what that crossing meant. We will sit in the taverns where Hume and Smith and Burns argued about the nature of the world. And we will follow the city through industrialization, through emigration, through the slow recovery of a national identity that was almost erased. This is the complete story of Edinburgh. Let's begin. It is around 600 AD. On a volcanic plug of basalt rock rising 130 meters above the surrounding lowlands, a chieftain of the Gododdin people builds a fortification. The rock is almost impossible to attack on 3 sides, sheer cliff faces dropping away into bog and marsh. The only approach is from the east, along a narrow ridge. The Gododdin call it Din Aidin, the fort of Aidin. Nobody knows with certainty what Aidin means. A personal name, perhaps, or a description of the landscape. Over centuries, Din Aidin becomes Edinburgh. The fort changes hands many times. Anglians take it from the Gododdin in 638 AD. The Scots take it back. Vikings raid the surrounding lands. The rock endures. It always endures. When Malcolm III, Canmore, Big Head, establishes his court here in the 11th century, Edinburgh begins its long transformation from a military outpost into something resembling a city. Malcolm's queen, Margaret, later canonized as Saint Margaret of Scotland, builds a small chapel on the castle rock. It still stands today, the oldest building in Edinburgh. 9 meters long, 5 meters wide, plain Romanesque arches, whitewashed walls. 1,000 years old and still intact on the same rock where it was built. From the castle, the city grows eastward along the ridge. The Royal Mile, actually slightly longer than a mile, running from the castle down to the Palace of Holyrood House, becomes the spine of medieval Edinburgh. Off both sides of this spine, narrow lanes drop steeply away. The Scots call them closes and wynds. Some are barely a metre wide. They plunge down into shadow even on summer afternoons. Into these closes, Edinburgh builds upward. By the 16th century, Edinburgh has some of the tallest buildings in the world outside of Italy. 12, 13, 14 stories of timber and stone, crammed with people on every floor. Nobles on the lower floors, merchants above them, craftsmen higher still. At the very top, in the rooms closest to the wind and the rain, the poorest families. A vertical city where your floor tells the world exactly who you are. It is also a city of extraordinary filth. There is no sewage system. At 10 o'clock each evening, a bell rings, the signal for residents to empty their chamber pots from their windows into the street below. The cry that goes with it, Gardez-l'eau, from the French gardes l'eau, watch out for the water. Though water is not quite the word, the gutters run with everything. Butchers throw offal into the street. Tanners dump their waste into the Nor Loch, the lake that sits below the north face of the castle. The Nor Loch becomes, over centuries, one of the most polluted bodies of water in Britain. Diseases move through the closes with terrible efficiency. Plague visits Edinburgh repeatedly. In 1645, a single outbreak kills half the population of some closes. And yet this filthy, vertical, chaotic city produces, in the middle of the 18th century, one of the most extraordinary intellectual explosions in human history. We need to understand why. By 1700, Edinburgh is already a city with pretensions above its circumstances. It has a university, founded in 1583, one of the oldest in the English-speaking world. It has a legal system, a medical school, a tradition of public argument going back generations. The Scottish Reformation of the 16th century, driven by John Knox from his pulpit in St. Giles Cathedral on the Royal Mile, has produced a culture that values literacy and education as religious duties. Every parish in Scotland is supposed to have a school. It doesn't always happen, but the aspiration is there. Then, in 1707, the Act of Union abolishes the Scottish Parliament and merges Scotland with England into the Kingdom of Great Britain. The Scottish nobility, who had bankrupted themselves in the disastrous Darwin scheme, an attempt to establish a Scottish colony in Panama that failed catastrophically, are bought out with English money and a guaranteed place in the new British Parliament in London. Scotland's political class moves to London. What is left behind in Edinburgh is the professional class: lawyers, doctors, ministers, professors. Men who cannot move to London because their livelihoods are here. And these men, denied political power, pour their energy into something else entirely: ideas. Between roughly 1740 and 1800, a group of men centered on Edinburgh produces an intellectual output that reshapes the modern world. They call themselves, without excessive modesty, the literati. The rest of the world will come to call their moment the Scottish Enlightenment. David Hume publishes his Treatise of Human Nature in 1739, aged 27. It applies scientific reasoning to human psychology and morality, and reaches conclusions so radical that they still disturb philosophers today. There is no rational basis for belief in cause and effect, he argues. There is no stable self. There is no God whose existence can be proved by reason. He writes this in Edinburgh and then worries that it will get him killed. It doesn't, quite. But it comes close. Adam Smith, a friend of Hume's, lectures at Glasgow and writes in Edinburgh. His Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, the same year as the American Declaration of Independence, not coincidentally, invents modern economics. The free market, the division of labor, the invisible hand. Every economics textbook in the world still begins here. James Hutton, a farmer and geologist, looks at the rock formations around Edinburgh and reaches a conclusion that will eventually be more disturbing than anything Hume wrote. The Earth is not 6,000 years old, as the Bible implies. It is unimaginably old. The processes shaping the landscape, erosion, sedimentation, volcanic activity, operate over timescales so vast that the human mind cannot properly grasp them. Hutton calls it deep time. He publishes his theory of the Earth in 1788. The implications take decades to fully land, but when they do, they prepare the ground for something else entirely. Robert Burns, a farmer's son from Ayrshire, arrives in Edinburgh in 1786 with a collection of poems in the Scots dialect that Edinburgh society finds simultaneously charming and slightly alarming. He is the right kind of genius, brilliant enough to be lionized, poor enough not to be threatening. He is taken up by the literati, celebrated at their dinner tables, exhibited at their assemblies. He drinks with them and sleeps with their daughters and writes poems about both. He goes back to farming eventually. He dies at 37. And somewhere in all of this, in the taverns on the high street, in the debating clubs and learned societies, in the smoke-filled rooms of what will become known as the Athens of the North, something else is happening. The city is looking at itself and finding itself wanting. Here is the question Edinburgh asks itself in the middle of the 18th century. How can the greatest intellectual city in the world be this dirty? The answer takes the form of a bridge and a competition. In 1766, a young architect named James Craig wins a competition to design a new town for Edinburgh. He is 22 years old. His plan is a masterpiece of Enlightenment geometry. 3 parallel streets running east to west on the flat ground north of the castle, crossed by 2 perpendicular streets. At each end, a garden square. The whole thing a grid, rational, ordered, clean, the physical expression of everything the Enlightenment believed about how human beings should live. Building begins almost immediately. North Bridge is constructed across the valley that separates the old town from the new. The Nor Loch is drained. The first houses go up on what will become Princes Street and George Street. The new town spreads over decades. Robert Adam, Britain's greatest neoclassical architect, designs Charlotte Square, finished in 1820. Its north side, number 7, is now the official residence of the First Minister of Scotland. The symmetry, the proportion, the absolute confidence that beauty and order are the same thing. What no one quite plans for is what happens to the old town. The new town is expensive. The people who can afford to live there are the same people who had been living in the 12-story tenements on the Royal Mile. The nobles on the lower floors, the lawyers, the merchants. One by one, they move. They cross the bridge into the clean new geometry, and they do not look back. What they leave behind is a vacuum. Into the closes and winds of the old town flood the poorest people in the city, and eventually the poorest people in Ireland, driven from their homes by the catastrophic famine of the 1840s. By 1850, the old town is one of the most overcrowded slums in Europe. Entire families in single rooms that once housed a single person. Disease returning with renewed force, cholera, typhus. Everything the Enlightenment was supposed to have banished. The two cities exist within a few hundred meters of each other. The rational and the squalid, the philosophical and the desperate. You can stand on the mound, the artificial hill of earth excavated from the new town foundations and dumped across the valley, and look in both directions simultaneously. On one side, the soaring classical columns of the Royal Scottish Academy and the National Gallery. On the other, the dark vertical cliffs of the old town tenements, smoke pouring from every chimney. Edinburgh is a city that invented the modern world and could not apply its own ideas to its own people. But let us walk the old town before it changes. Because in 1820, before the worst of the overcrowding, it is still one of the most fascinating places in Britain. We enter from the castle esplanade and begin to walk east down the Royal Mile. The street is wide enough here, 40 feet across, room for carts to pass in both directions. The buildings on either side rise 6, 8, 10 stories. Look up and the sky is a narrow strip between the roof lines. The first closes on the right, lead down to the Grassmarket, a wide open square that has been Edinburgh's market and place of public execution for 400 years. The gibbet stood here. Body snatchers worked here. In the taverns around the Grassmarket, men drank and bargained and disappeared. Back on the Royal Mile, we pass John Knox's house, the 16th century timber-fronted building where the great reformer may or may not have lived. The historians argue, the tourists don't care. They photograph it anyway. At the Lawn Market, the street broadens slightly. This is where cloth was sold, lawn, linen, the fine goods brought in from the continent. The closes off the Lawn Market are some of the most storied in the city. Lady Stairs Close leads to a courtyard that has barely changed in 300 years. At the High Street, we reach the heart of it. St. Giles's Cathedral, not technically a cathedral, the Scots Presbyterians don't like the word, they call it the High Kirk, dominates the centre of the street. Its crown steeple rises 49 metres above the Royal Mile. Inside, the stone is cold and the light is grey, and the ghost of John Knox feels closer than is comfortable. Around St. Giles, in the small open space called Parliament Square, the old Scottish Parliament building stands, now part of the Court of Session. Here, until 1707, the Scottish Parliament sat. Here, the Union was voted through, in a room barely larger than a tennis court, by men who had been, in many cases, bribed. The question that every Scottish child is eventually asked, was the Union a betrayal or a transaction? The answer depends on who you ask. In Edinburgh, in 2026, the question is more alive than it has been in 300 years. We continue east. The Royal Mile slopes gently downward. The closes continue. Anchor Close, where the first edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica was printed in 1768. Brodie's Close, home of Deacon Brodie, respectable town councillor by day, burglar by night, executed on a gallows he himself had designed in his capacity as a master craftsman. Robert Louis Stevenson was told the story as a child. He never forgot it. He turned it into a story about a respectable doctor and his hidden violent self. He called it The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Edinburgh keeps doing this, keeps producing its own contradictions as if contradiction is the point. We reach the foot of the Royal Mile. The Palace of Holyrood House sits at the bottom, the official Scottish residence of the King, its towers framing a view back up the entire length of the city. Behind the palace, Arthur's Seat, an extinct volcano rising 251 meters above the city, stands in what is now Holyrood Park. The volcanic rock on which Edinburgh is built does not let you forget what it is. Now we need to talk about a young man who never actually lived in Edinburgh, but whose connection to this city, and to the ideas born here, changes everything. Charles Darwin is born in Shrewsbury in 1809. He comes to Edinburgh in 1825 at 16 to study medicine at the university. He hates medicine. He finds the surgery without anesthetic. This is 1825, there is no other kind. Unbearable to watch. He skips lectures, he wanders the city, he joins student societies where he argues about natural history and geology. What he absorbs here matters. Edinburgh in 1825 is still vibrating with the ideas of the Enlightenment. James Hutton's deep time, the idea of an unimaginably ancient Earth, is in the intellectual water. Robert Grant, one of Darwin's professors, is a convinced evolutionist, building on the work of the French naturalist Lamarck. Darwin is young and impressionable, and Edinburgh plants seeds that will take 30 more years to flower. He leaves Edinburgh without finishing his degree, goes to Cambridge instead, goes on the Beagle, spends the next 20 years being very, very careful before he publishes what Edinburgh started teaching him. On the Origin of Species comes out in 1859. It applies the logic of the Scottish Enlightenment, reason over tradition, evidence over authority, to the question of where living things come from. The answer removes God from the equation entirely. Hume had argued there was no rational basis for religious belief. Darwin provides the rational basis for an alternative. Together, they constitute the greatest intellectual revolution of the modern era. And both threads run back to Edinburgh. By the time Darwin publishes, Edinburgh itself is in transformation. The Industrial Revolution has come later and less completely to Edinburgh than to Glasgow or Manchester. Edinburgh's economy is based on law, medicine, finance, printing and brewing. Cleaner industries than cotton or steel. The city grows steadily through the 19th century, but does not experience the explosive, catastrophic expansion of the west of Scotland. What Edinburgh experiences instead is a slower, more complicated reckoning with its own contradictions. The Old Town slum is gradually addressed. Not quickly, not generously, but addressed. The great Victorian slum clearances of the 1860s and 1870s demolish some of the worst closes. New buildings go up, water is piped in. Sewage, finally, begins to be dealt with. The city spreads outward in all directions. Victorian tenements, 4 and 5 stories, solid stone, far better built than their medieval predecessors, cover the hills north and south of the city centre. Morningside, Marchmont, Stockbridge. The working class in these tenements, the middle class a few streets away. Still a vertical city, still a city of stairs, but no longer a city where people die at 25 in a room they share with 8 others. Scotland, through the 19th century, is exporting its people. The Highland clearances, the forced removal of tens of thousands of Scottish crofters from their ancestral lands to make way for more profitable sheep farming, had been transforming the north of Scotland since the 1750s. By the 1830s and 1840s, it is accelerating. Entire communities evicted, villages burned, people put on ships to Canada, to Australia, to New Zealand. Edinburgh watches this and does almost nothing. The lawyers and landowners who benefit from the clearances are the same class that attends the new town assembly rooms and sits in the Court of Session and commissions portraits of themselves from the Royal Scottish Academy. The dispossession of Gaelic Scotland is the dark chapter that the Athens of the North never properly reckons with. The ideas of the Enlightenment, liberty, reason, human dignity, apply, it turns out, to some humans more than others. 150,000 people leave Scotland in the 1840s alone. By 1900, the total Scottish diaspora, people of Scottish descent living outside Scotland numbers in the millions. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the United States. Wherever they go, they carry something with them. A stubbornness, a particular combination of sentiment and practicality. An argument about whether they left or were pushed that never quite resolves. Edinburgh enters the 20th century as a prosperous, confident, deeply conservative city. The financial centre of Scotland, home to the Scottish legal and educational establishment. A city that had been the intellectual capital of the world and was now comfortably a pleasant place for wealthy people to live. Then the First World War, then the Depression, then the Second World War. Edinburgh escapes the bombing that devastates Glasgow, Clydebank, Coventry. The city centre remains intact, but the people are changed. The certainties are gone. After 1945, the question that Scotland has been half asking for 2 centuries becomes, slowly, impossible to ignore. Who governs Scotland, and for whom? The Scottish National Party, founded in 1934, grows steadily through the post-war decades. The 1970s oil boom in the North Sea, Scotland's oil, as the SNP puts it, provides an economic argument for independence that sentiment alone never quite managed. In 1979, a referendum on Scottish devolution fails, narrowly and controversially. The Thatcher years harden something. Her government's policies devastate the industrial communities of the west of Scotland. The poll tax is introduced in Scotland a year before England, as what feels to many Scots like a deliberate experiment on a population that didn't vote for the government imposing it. The poll tax riots in Edinburgh in 1989 are among the most violent in Britain. In 1997, devolution is finally approved. In 1999, the Scottish Parliament reconvenes in Edinburgh for the first time since 1707. It meets initially in the Church of Scotland General Assembly Hall on the Mound. Then, in 2004, it moves into a new building at the foot of the Royal Mile, right next to Holyrood House, right below Arthur's Seat. The Holyrood Parliament building is designed by the Catalan architect Enric Miralles, who dies before it is finished. It is strange and organic and unlike anything else in Edinburgh. It looks, people say, like upturned boats, or leaves, or something that grew out of the volcanic rock rather than being placed on top of it. It costs nearly 5 times the original estimate. It is either a masterpiece or a catastrophe, depending on who you ask. It is probably both. Edinburgh today is a city of 550,000 people. The city proper. The Greater Edinburgh area considerably larger. It is the second largest financial centre in the United Kingdom after London. It has 5 universities, including one of the world's great research institutions. It has the most intact medieval city centre in Northern Europe. Every August it hosts the Edinburgh Festival and the Edinburgh Fringe, the largest arts festival on earth, turning this grey, serious Presbyterian city into the strangest, most chaotic, most intoxicating place imaginable for 4 weeks a year. The Royal Mile is lined with tourist shops selling shortbread and whisky and clan tartans, many of them invented in the 19th century by the same romanticisation of Scottish identity that Sir Walter Scott largely manufactured for a royal visit in 1822. The authentic and the fabricated site comfortably side by side on the same cobblestones. Edinburgh has long since made its peace with not being entirely real. But some things are entirely real. The castle on its rock, Margaret's Chapel, the Closes, St. Giles. The Enlightenment ideas still running through the world's economic and philosophical bloodstream. The people who were removed from their land and the people who did the removing and the argument between them that has never been settled. The Scottish Parliament sitting again in a building below the volcanic mountain, arguing about the same question that has been argued about since 1707. And somewhere on the Mound, on a grey Edinburgh morning, you can still stand and look in both directions. Old Town on one side, New Town on the other. The city that divided itself in the 18th century to prove that reason could triumph over squalor. Still divided, still arguing, still producing, from the friction between its two halves, something the world occasionally needs. Ideas. The mist is coming in off the Firth of Forth. The castle has disappeared into it. This is Edinburgh. It has looked this way for 1,000 years. It will look this way for 1,000 more. Thanks for watching. If this walk through Edinburgh moved you, subscribe and let us know in the comments which British city should we walk through next. We'll see you in the past.